in Syria present a huge conundrum for President Obama. Let's take a look at how he's handled them so far. Joining me now to discuss this is Faisal Al-Yafai. He's the chief columnist for The National. He's joining us out of Abu Dhabi. And also joining us from London, Alan Mendoza, the executive director of the British think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. And I want to begin with you, Alan. You've been a critic of President Obama. How did you see this speech? Was it effective or not?
Well, I think it was obviously defence of the policy we've seen, but it can't mask the fact that what we're watching is, on our watch, essentially, the dissipation of American power before our eyes. The president speaks of withdrawal. Essentially, he calls it leadership, but it is withdrawal from the world. But you're leaving a vacuum, and others are going to step into that vacuum. And we in Europe are very concerned about the loss of American power that we are seeing. You know, when the British drew from their empire after the Second World War, Churchill called it scuttle. Well, this is a scuttle speech from President Obama.
Faisal Al-Yafai, the Europeans are worried about that power vacuum left by the Americans. Obviously, the Europeans don't plan to step in. What's the view from the Middle East?
You know, everything that Alan said could apply equally to the Middle East. There is a very big trust deficit in the region, as there is in Europe, with regard to President Obama's leadership. The allies in this region, particularly in the Gulf, simply do not believe that Barack Obama would step in if red lines were crossed elsewhere, as they were in Syria, with no response.
You know, gentlemen, and you leave me in the role here of being a defender of President Obama and his policies. Let me do it from the perspective of the American public, weary of war after 10 years. Everybody is saying, America, you've got to stand up and do this. What he's saying is countries in the Middle East, countries in Europe have to stand up their defense spending, which they are doing in parts of the Arab world, but certainly not in Europe, and be a real partner in all this, not leave it to the Americans to be the ones who pay in blood and treasure for every conflict, for every confrontation. Alan, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a very unfair point of view. The Europeans in various places have backed America. Britain certainly has lost money, treasure, blood in Iraq, Afghanistan as well. It is true we could do more. I would certainly back doing more, but we need America to lead in this regard. There's one superpower, it needs to take the lead, otherwise you have countries like Russia, China doing that.
Faisal, you know, you've had Gulf states, Qatar, you've had Saudi Arabia, you've had the UAE that have been trying to prop up the rebels in Syria. The United States could do more, but it's not going to intervene.
Well, bear in mind that it isn't just what America will do, it's that what they will not allow others to do. So, for example, when Ahmed Jarba, the leader of the Syrian opposition, was in Washington, he was asking for man-pads, and he was trying to get the Americans to either provide them or allow their allies in the region to provide them, because that is the only thing that can tip against the Assad army. This is a speech, let's be clear, that will be very well received in Damascus today. President Assad, sitting in the presidential palace waiting for the ballots to come in, which will doubtless return him to power for another 5 years, will be very pleased to hear that there is no response coming from the international community. When President Obama says a high threshold has to be met for military action, he's right. But a high threshold is 150,000 people slaughtered, cities destroyed, millions of people living in refugee camps and on the move. That is a high enough threshold.
Alan, as you look across that speech, and I think one of the observations I made, I didn't hear any of my U.S. counterparts make it, and that was very tepid response from the cadets there at West Point, looking at that. Is that the same response you would expect from Europe today?
Absolutely. I think it's, as Faisal has said, if you set that high bar, you are sending a message around the world to dictators, to authoritarian states. You can act as you please. We will set red lines, we will cancel them, we will cross over. He can't, the president can't on the one hand say he's got the best hammer in the world and then tell the people who represent that best hammer that actually they're going to sit at home while the world plays out in wicked ways in front of them. That's why there was a tepid response, I feel.
Faisal, President Obama, you know, he laid out there all of the different thresholds. He talked about those thresholds that Alan just mentioned, but he didn't set any priorities. He didn't set any, any specific area. He did announce, $5 billion to help fund counterterrorism operations with partners, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Chad, whether it's in Nigeria, other places that might be confronting terrorist problems. Will that go over well?
It will. definitely with regard to the $5 billion, that will go over well, especially in this region where one of the biggest concerns the Gulf states have is, of course, Yemen. Yemen has a huge problem in the south with al-Qaeda emnants, the remnants of this ACAP, as they call it. And yes, the $5 billion will go a long way. I think Yemen is one of the countries he mentioned in the speech. So it isn't that there's nothing in the speech to applaud. It's just that I think expectations were that there would be something said about the single biggest problem that confronts this region today, and that is the Syrian civil war. And Obama had nothing to say about it. When Alan makes the point that he was talking about having a very powerful hammer, he spent most of the time, as Nick Payton Walsh said, being the philosopher-in-chief and reinterpreting what a nail is. We can all see what a nail is. A nail is a conflict which is burning out of control and will drag the entire region with it. That's a nail. Obama has the hammer, and it is time he used it.
All right. Faisal Al-Yafai and Alan Mendoza. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. I don't know what the White House is going to think about your analysis, but I think it came from the heart. Appreciate it.